The coffee in Mira's mug had gone cold 3 hours ago, but she hadn't noticed until the spreadsheet on her laptop finally balanced, and she reached for it out of habit. 0. The number stared back at her from the bottom of column G. Not a deficit, not a surplus. 0, which meant her former employer had been skimming exactly what she'd suspected. $12,000 a month, routed through a ghost vendor called Halcyon Supplies that had never supplied anything to anyone. She'd spent 4 months building that case. 4 months of unpaid overtime, of eating instant noodles in her car during lunch, because the office kitchen made her skin crawl after she started noticing the discrepancies. 4 months of saving every receipt, every purchase order, every email thread where the numbers didn't quite line up. And then on a Tuesday morning in March, she'd walked into the Tremblay and Associates boardroom with a 40-page report, a flash drive, and the quiet certainty of someone who has done the math 3 times and gotten the same answer. By noon, she'd been walked out of the building with a cardboard box and a non-disclosure agreement. They'd given her 2 hours to sign it. The severance was generous enough that her lawyer, she'd called one from the parking lot, hands shaking, had told her to take it. "You'll win the principal and lose the decade," he'd said. She'd signed. She'd deposited the check. She'd sat in her apartment in Verdun for 6 days without opening the blinds. On the 7th day, she updated her resume. That was 8 months ago. Since then, she'd had 4 interviews, 2 second interviews, and 0 offers. The industry was smaller than people thought. Tremblay and Associates was well connected. Nobody said anything directly. People in finance were too careful for that, but she recognized the particular quality of silence that followed when she mentioned her previous employer. The way the energy in the room shifted, the way HR reps suddenly needed to circle back. She'd started freelancing, small contracts, a bakery in Rosemont that needed its books reconciled, a property management company in NDG that wanted someone to clean up a mess their last accountant had left behind. She was good at cleaning up messes. It was the only thing she'd ever been unambiguously good at. The problem was that small contracts paid small money. The problem was that her lease renewal was in 6 weeks, and her landlord had mentioned, very casually, that the building had been sold. The problem was that it was February in Montreal, and her radiator had started making a sound like someone tapping a spoon against a pipe, rhythmically all night, every night. Mira saved the spreadsheet, closed the laptop, and picked up the cold coffee anyway. Outside, the city was doing what Montreal did in February, existing in a state of beautiful, inconvenient misery. Snow that had been white on Saturday was grey-black slush by Monday. The kind of cold that didn't just sit on your skin but got inside your coat somehow, between the layers, despite all rational physics. She had a meeting in an hour. Not an interview. She'd stopped calling them interviews after the 3rd one went nowhere. A referral, passed along through her old professor at McGill, who had mentioned her name to someone who had mentioned it to someone else who had called her, and been extremely vague about what, exactly, the job entailed. Bookkeeping, the woman on the phone had said. Accounts reconciliation. The pay is better than market rate. She'd paused, then added, discretion is expected. Discretion was expected. Mira had written that down. The address was in Westmount. The kind of Westmount street where the houses had names instead of numbers, and the driveways were long enough to forget you were still technically in the city. She'd looked it up on the way and found nothing. No company registered at that address, no business listing, nothing at all. Just a house, according to Google Maps. And according to Google Maps, it was a very large house, with its satellite view deliberately blurred. She almost didn't go. She almost called the number back and said she'd found something else. She had a speech prepared, a competing offer, a conflict of schedule, very sorry, best of luck. Instead, she put on her good coat, the grey one she saved for things that mattered, and took the metro. The door was answered before she knocked. That was the first strange thing. She'd raised her hand, knuckles toward the wood, and the door had opened, and a man in a dark suit was standing there, looking at her like she was expected, which she was, but not like that. Not with that particular flatness in his eyes. "Mrs. Vásquez," he said. "Yes, come in." The interior was exactly what the exterior had promised. High ceilings, wood floors that didn't creak, art on the walls that she recognized as genuinely expensive without being able to tell you the artists' names. It smelled like money and cedar and something else she couldn't identify. Nothing flashy. That was the second strange thing. She'd been bracing herself for flashy. She was shown to a room that looked like a study. Bookshelves, a fireplace that was actually lit, 2 chairs arranged with precise geometry around a low table, and left alone with the instruction that someone would be with her shortly. Mira sat, looked at her hands, counted things the way she always did when she was nervous. 14 books on the shelf within her eyeline. 7 were in French, 4 in English, 3 in what looked like German. The fireplace had 11 logs in the stack beside it. The chair she was sitting in had 6 brass buttons down each arm. She'd been counting since she was 7 years old. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't have bad days or hidden agendas or reasons to manipulate you. Numbers were the only thing she'd ever fully trusted. The door opened. He didn't knock. That was, she catalogued it immediately. Not a power move. Or not only a power move. It was the movement of someone who had never needed to knock in his own house and had simply not thought to start. He crossed the room without looking at her directly, which should have felt dismissive but didn't. He poured 2 glasses of water from a carafe on the sideboard, set one on the table in front of her, and sat in the other chair. Then he looked at her. Rafferty. That was the name the woman on the phone had eventually provided, after Mira had asked 3 times. Just the surname, like a weather system. Rafferty. He was older than she'd expected. Not old, mid-40s maybe, or the kind of 40-something that carried its years differently depending on the light. There was a scar along his jaw, faint and silvery, the kind that had been serious once. His eyes were grey-brown, the color of river water before a storm, and they moved across her face the same way she moved across a spreadsheet, quickly, methodically, looking for the thing that didn't balance. "You worked for Tremblay," he said. Not a question. "For 4 years. And then you found something, and then I found something," she agreed. "And they paid you to be quiet about it." She kept her face very still. "I signed a non-disclosure agreement. That's not what I asked." She looked at him for a long moment. Yes. He nodded once, like she'd confirmed something he already knew. "The person who referred you to me, your professor, he told me you were the best numbers person he'd produced in 15 years. He also told me you were the most stubborn." He said stubborn? He said principled. A very brief pause. "Same thing in my experience." Mira picked up the glass of water, drank, set it down. "What does the work involve? My operation has accounts across several companies. Some of those companies are legitimate. Some of them are." He considered his words with a kind of careful precision that she recognized as genuine, not performed, more complicated. "I need someone who can look at all of it without asking questions they don't need answered, while also being able to identify when numbers are wrong and why. Someone who can find the discrepancies. Someone who can find them and fix them," he said. Quietly. She should have left. She knew that. She understood, sitting in that room with the fire behind him and the carefully curated books and the silence that was several layers thicker than normal silence, exactly who Rafferty was. Not the specific details, not yet, but the shape of it. The outline. The way he'd said, more complicated, with the particular tone of someone who had decided honesty was more efficient than pretense. "What does better than market rate mean?" she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, exactly. More like the idea of one. 4,000 a week, cash or transfer, your preference. No contract. Either party can end the arrangement at any time. Mira thought about her radiator, about her landlord's casual mention of the building sale, about the non-disclosure agreement she'd signed while sitting in her car in a parking lot, hands shaking, 4 months of evidence condensed into a settlement check and a permanent professional shadow. "I have one condition," she said. He waited. "I don't touch anything that involves people getting hurt. Financial? Fine. Whatever you need reconciled, whatever system you want set up, whatever you need documented or undocumented. But I'm not signing off on anything where the number at the end of the column represents a person. He studied her for a moment. She held very still under it. Agreed, he said. She started on a Wednesday. The office, if you could call it that, was on the 3rd floor of the Westmount house. Through a door that required a key card she was given on her first morning. Inside, 3 monitors, a server stack, filing cabinets with actual locks, and a desk that someone had clearly spent money on. On the desk was a handwritten note that said only, "Start with Meridian Holdings. Current ledger is in the blue folder. Previous reconciliation was incomplete." She opened the blue folder. She found, in the first 20 minutes, 4 incomplete entries, and what appeared to be a systematic round-trip transfer designed to make one account look solvent when it wasn't. She fixed the 4 incomplete entries. She flagged the round-trip transfer with a yellow sticky note and wrote, "This is either a mistake or fraud. Please advise." She found out the next morning that the previous bookkeeper had been let go. She did not ask why. Some questions, she was learning, were not worth the answer. Rafferty was not what she'd built in her head during that first meeting. He was in the office, his office, 1 floor down, most mornings when she arrived, and she could track his presence by small signs. The smell of coffee that was better than anything from her corner dépanneur, the low sound of phone calls conducted in a voice that never quite rose to audible, the occasional appearance in her doorway. He didn't hover. He appeared with purpose, a question, a folder, a clarification. "The Cavendish account," he said on her 3rd day, standing in the doorway with a mug. "3rd quarter figures. You'll see a gap in the entertainment expenses." "I saw it," she said without looking up. "It's been there since Q2. Do you want me to fix it, flag it, or explain it away?" A pause that lasted long enough that she finally looked up. "Explain it away how?" he asked. "Conference costs, the kind that nobody itemizes. Happens all the time in legitimate businesses, so it doesn't stand out." She held his gaze. "I'm not recommending it. I'm telling you what the options are. That's my job." "Yes," he said after another pause. "Flag it." She flagged it. She went home that evening on the metro and ate pasta and watched something mindless on her laptop and told herself she was fine. She was mostly fine. The part that was not entirely fine was smaller and stranger than she'd expected. It had nothing to do with what Rafferty did, or who he was, or the layered and complicated moral arithmetic of the work. She'd made peace with that, or a version of peace that would serve for now. The part that was not fine was that she was beginning to notice things about him that had nothing to do with the ledgers. The way he never left before she did, which she knew because she'd started staying late to finish reconciliations, and his office light was always still on when she went to get her coat. The way he said thank you when she handed him a completed report, quietly, like he meant it and knew most people didn't. The way he'd placed her coffee on her desk one morning, the good coffee, from wherever he ordered it, without explanation or comment, as if noticing someone's cold mug and replacing it was simply what a person did. She was 31 years old. She had a very specific type of radar for when someone wanted something from her that wasn't on the stated invoice. She'd developed it carefully, after a few years of being used as a convenience by people who found her competence useful and her presence forgettable. Rafferty didn't make her feel forgettable. That was the problem. The thing about working for someone like Rafferty, she was 5 weeks in before she let herself think it clearly, was that everyone else was afraid of him. Not overtly. It wasn't theatrical. It was the way people in the house moved around him, gave him the room to make decisions at his own pace, never rushed or prompted or second-guessed. The 2 men she saw most frequently, who seemed to handle the physical logistics of whatever Rafferty ran, were formidable in their own right, large, quiet, clearly capable of things she chose not to think too much about, and they deferred to him with the particular deference of people who'd seen what happened when they didn't. Mira was not afraid of him. She didn't think this made her brave. She thought it probably made her stupid in the specific way of someone who'd learned to read numbers better than people and kept misjudging the risk in faces. But every morning when she keyed in the code and sat down at her desk, she felt the same uncomplicated certainty she always felt when the work was good. I know what I'm doing here. I know what I'm looking for. I know what I'll find. That certainty was comfortable. more comfortable than most things. She was on her 7th week when she found the second problem. It was buried in the Lachance commercial real estate accounts, a company Rafferty held through 2 other companies, which was normal enough, and it looked, at first glance, like a tax timing issue. But Mira had spent 4 months at Tremblay learning the difference between something that looked like a tax timing issue and something that had been arranged to look like a tax timing issue, and this was the second thing. Someone was moving money out of Lachance. Not large amounts, $80, $90, sometimes $110,000, each transaction coded to a different receivable category, each one small enough to miss in a single quarter, each one adding up to just under $2 million over 18 months. She printed the full run of transactions. She made 3 copies. She put 2 in her bag and left 1 on her desk under a paperweight she'd started keeping there for exactly this kind of situation. Then she went downstairs. Rafferty was on a call when she knocked. He looked at her through the glass panel in his door with an expression that said, silently, that this had better be worth it. She held up the printout. His expression changed. She wasn't sure how to name what it changed to, except that it was attentive in a way he didn't usually let show. He ended the call. She laid the printout on his desk. She'd highlighted the transactions in yellow and written the running total at the bottom in red, $1,874,000. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. How long? He said finally. 18 months, give or take. Did you document the methodology? On my desk, and in 2 other places. He looked up at that. Something passed across his face. Brief, complicated, impossible to fully read before he went back to the printout. Who else has seen this? No one. You're sure? I'm sure, she said. It's why I came down instead of emailing it. He was quiet again. She waited, because she'd learned that about him. His silences were not gaps to fill but decisions being processed in real time, and interrupting them cost more than it bought. I need to know, he said at last, whether you understand what you've found. She did. She'd understood it when she printed the first copy. Someone inside your organization has been taking from you for a year and a half. He nodded once. And now you have to figure out who. He looked at her, straight at her. No angle, no deflection, the way he rarely did. That's not your problem. No, she agreed. My problem is whether I'm still safe in this building while you figure it out. She kept her voice even. Because if I found it, the person who did it might realize that eventually. And I'd like to have a plan before that becomes relevant. Something shifted in his face again. Not the not-quite smile. Something slower and less composed. Something she'd never seen from him and wasn't sure she was supposed to see now. He looked at the printout, then at her, and when he spoke his voice was quieter than usual. You're safe here, he said. I know you believe that. I need you to believe it. She thought about saying something careful. Something that gave her an exit. Instead, she said, I believe you'll do everything you can. I'm not sure that's the same thing. He held her gaze for a long moment. No, he said, it's not. She went back upstairs. She completed the remaining reconciliation. She ate the sandwich she'd brought from home and drank the good coffee and counted the rain against the window. She couldn't count the drops, obviously, but she could count the rhythm of the sound, which was close enough. She did not go home that night. Not by his request. He hadn't asked. He'd sent one of his men, the quieter one, whose name was Tate, to tell her that the 3rd-floor office had a lock that worked from the inside and that the guest room on the 2nd floor was available if she preferred not to be alone in her apartment until things were resolved. She thought about her apartment. The radiator. The leak under the kitchen sink she'd been meaning to report to her landlord since November. She stayed. The guest room was better than her apartment in every physical sense. The bed was a proper bed. The radiator did not tap. There were towels that had been washed recently. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the chain of choices that had brought her here and whether any of them, individually or in sequence, had been mistakes. The Tremblay sign-off? Probably not. The severance had kept her alive for 8 months. The freelancing? A holding pattern, not a mistake. The Westmount house, she was still running the numbers on that one. She fell asleep before she reached a conclusion. The next 3 days had a quality she didn't have a word for. The house was quieter, or occupied in different ways. People moved through it with purpose, arrived and left at odd hours, held conversations in rooms with closed doors. Rafferty was present and not present in alternating rhythms. She completed her work and left it in the agreed place and received, each morning, a new folder and a note. On the 4th day he came upstairs at 7 in the evening while she was finishing the last entry in a subsidiary account. It was Hennessy, he said. He stood in the doorway. He knocked this time, which she filed, and looked not quite at her but in her direction. He's been dealt with. She didn't ask what dealt with meant. She understood she didn't want to know. Okay, she said. You can go back to your apartment. I know. He didn't move. Mira saved the file and closed the laptop and looked at him. She had, over the past 7 weeks, developed a fairly complete picture of Rafferty, his patterns, his preferences, the particular economy of his communication that meant he used exactly as many words as necessary and never more. She knew that he arrived at 8 and left after her, and that he took his coffee without anything in it, and that he'd read the same book 3 times. She'd noticed the spine, and that he had, somewhere, a sister he called once a week from a room she wasn't allowed in. She did not know, and had carefully not known, whether he was lonely. She suspected that he would describe himself as private rather than lonely. She suspected he had made peace with the distance between himself and everyone else as a structural necessity, the way she'd made peace, once upon a time, with being the person who found the discrepancies and got walked out of buildings for it. I'm not going back tonight, she said. He looked at her. Why? Because it's snowing and my radiator is broken and this bed is better. She paused. Also because I'm in the middle of something and I'd rather finish it tonight. Another long look. She'd gotten better at reading them. Not fully, he kept too much back for that, but enough to know the difference between calculating and considering. This was considering. The kitchen is available, he said. If you need it, thank you. He started to leave. Rafferty. He stopped. She was not impulsive. She wanted that on the record. For herself. For whatever version of herself was doing the accounting later. She had spent 4 months building a case against her last employer because she didn't act on suspicion. She waited for proof. She had spent 8 months eating instant noodles and taking small contracts because she didn't compromise on what she could demonstrate was right. I found your books because they were worth finding, she said. I stayed because the work is good. I want you to know that those 2 things are true, and also, they're not the only reasons. The silence was long enough that she thought she'd miscalculated. She was already reviewing the conversation for the error, the word that had cost more than it bought. I know, he said. She looked up. He was still in the doorway. The light from the hallway was behind him, and she couldn't fully read his face, which might have been why he stayed there. I've known for a while, he said. I was waiting to see what you'd do with it. And you found the LaChance problem, he said. Before you did anything about the other thing, which told me something. What did it tell you? A pause, then quietly, that you're the kind of person who finishes the work first. Mira thought about that. That's a very specific compliment. I give very specific compliments, he said, and that was as close to a smile as she'd ever seen from him, and it was enough. She went back to the account. He went back to his office. The snow kept falling outside, piling up against the windows in the particular generous, indifferent way Montreal snow had in February, blanketing everything, accounting for nothing, making the city briefly look like somewhere else, somewhere without history or receivables or the particular weight of 8 months of careful, difficult survival. Mira entered the last figure. The column balanced. She added it to the stack of completed reconciliations and put the cap back on her pen and felt, in the cool arithmetic of things, the work was done and it was good, and she was, for the first time in a long time, exactly where the numbers said she was supposed to be.